live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. In this video, we're going to talk about Friday's Child. So, in this episode, a small party of the crew, Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and random crew member who's dead 3 seconds after hitting the planet, go down to this planet with a very militaristic tribal structure. I say militaristic, not like organized mass armies, something like this. We're not talking like totalitarian regimes with parades of goose-stepping soldiers and nuclear missiles. This is a society in which fighting, personal combat is very, very prevalent. There's a lot of taboos. McCoy is able to navigate them because he was stationed on this planet for a while, and so on and so on. Basically, they are going down to try and negotiate a mining treaty with the head of the 10 tribes, the Tier, as the title is. When they get there, they find that there's a Klingon! Oh! Which, incidentally, is why random crew member gets immediately murdered, because he draws a weapon on the Klingon as soon as he sees him, and one of the dudes takes their little, Nerf Frisbee knives and, basically kills the guy immediately. So that creates some tension. There's also competing factions among these tribes. The Tier is open to listening to both Kirk and the Klingon, but there's a guy named Ma'ab who is not super thrilled with the way that things are going under the current Tier. He ends up leading a rebellion in which the Tier is killed. Ma'ab becomes the new Tier. And then, ironically enough, the Klingon is like, hey, we had a deal. Now that you're the Tier, you should hold up your deal. And Ma'ab is like, maybe I won't. Maybe I will listen to Kirk and the Enterprise, which is literally the thing that he overthrew the previous Tier for potentially doing. Yeah, that's how it goes, I guess. But the other wrinkle in all of this is that the previous Tier had a wife who was very, very pregnant. She is now going to be killed because she is carrying she's carrying the heir to the throne. And so, as everyone knows, if you've studied medieval or Renaissance history in Europe, for instance, once you take over the kingdom, you murder all of the other people who might have a claim to the throne. So, she's going to be killed, but McCoy, Kirk, and Spock are like, haha, we have escaped now from this camp, and also we're taking this woman with us. So they go off into the hills. They are pursued by Ma'ab and the Klingon and all the tribespeople and whatever it is. McCoy is trying to convince this woman that she should actually want her baby, because in this culture, babies belong to men, etc., etc. And basically there's extended fighting between the Enterprise crew, the tribespeople, and then the Klingon sort of betrays the tribespeople and is like, I'm going off on my own, being rogue. I demand that you give me my weapons and whatever. So eventually the Klingon gets killed. Ma'ab sacrifices himself to allow the Klingon to be killed. And then everybody's like, well, great, let's all fucking have a mining treaty now. Like, that's kind of how it ends up. The baby is born. He becomes the new Tier. His mother becomes the regent. And so, everything is what it is. There's a number of elements here that are worth talking about. One, again, recurring one that I think I may be becoming somewhat boring about this topic is the treatment of women. But again, this is another episode in which women's role is really central, because in this society, women are very much men's property. The children, the babies, belong to men, not to the woman, to the point where this woman doesn't, now that her husband is dead, she does not even care if she has this baby. We find out that one of the taboos is that if you touch a woman who is not your property, then her nearest male relative challenges you to a fight to the death. They try and trick Kirk into that, but it doesn't work because McCoy knows that taboo. So there's a lot of stuff going on with that. There's a lot of, again, this women are property bullshit that crops up over and over again. Other things that are going on. Sorry, my cat is screaming. I don't know if the mic is going to pick that up or not. One of the other big things that's going on here, I think, is this question of transcultural diplomacy, which is actually a really interesting element of this episode. Because this is obviously a situation in which the Enterprise crew have gone into a very different culture, a culture with very specific rules, norms, behavior structures, etc., etc., and violating any of those rules, norms, behavioral structures, etc., etc., can be seen as a grave insult warranting death. So, this is one of the things that I think is really, really interesting and important in terms of international relations and the contact between people of different cultures. How do you navigate a cultural context in which things that for you might be perfectly normal, like accepting a piece of fruit that a woman hands to you, how do you navigate a cultural context in which that might be a trespass worthy of a fight to the death? So this is actually a really interesting component of it. But then you've also got the other element of negotiation here, which is competing factions negotiating over, for instance, the same resources. Both the Klingons and the Federation want this particular resource that is abundant on this planet, and they have each sent delegations. Because the Klingons and the Federation are extremely hostile to one another, there's some tension there, right? Their interests are diametrically opposed, and so the techniques that each side is going to use to try and secure their interests depend on their understanding of what is going to be effective and persuasive for this tribal society, depends on what power alliances they can secure within this culture, and depends on how they can present the other. So the Klingon, for instance, accuses Kirk and the human species of basically being cowardly. He accuses them of being afraid of death, which for a society built on, hey, it's Tuesday, time to fight to the death, is probably a pretty significant problem that's going to really undermine this society's confidence in the Enterprise crew. On the other hand, there's a moment where, for instance, there's a debate going on in front of the original tier. Mob makes an argument, the Klingon makes an argument, and then McCoy, there's my cat, he's now heading for my laundry basket. And then McCoy is basically like, what the Klingon says is unimportant. We don't hear him, which is, in this culture, a way of calling the Klingon a liar. And so there are these sort of verbal jabs, verbal debates about who is trustworthy, who aligns with the values of this culture, etc., etc. And Mob loses some confidence in the Klingon when Kirk challenges the Klingon to single combat, and the Klingon appears afraid. So we've got all these things going on. These questions of like, how do you negotiate these cultural contexts, and how do you show respect for other people's cultures when their way of looking at the world may be strikingly different than your own? And then the last one, I think, is the question of leadership, right? Because again, Mob leads a revolt, kills the original TER. He does this because the TER is thinking about, if not actually going to, negotiate with the Enterprise crew rather than the Klingon. And then as soon as Mob becomes TER, he's like, maybe I'll negotiate with the Enterprise crew rather than the Klingon. And in a way, that's actually quite good, because what Mob says is maybe to be a tier is to think in new ways. And I think that's actually quite an interesting insight. To be a leader requires you to look at the world in different ways than when you are not the leader. When you are a follower and you can sort of say, here's how things should be done, from the perspective of someone without any decision-making power, there's an element of like, what is it, armchair quarterback, right? Where that's this idea from sports, right? Where you're watching a football game and you're like, oh, they should have run this play or something like this. It's very different to be in that situation where you are actually making that decision, you are actually implementing that policy, than it is to sort of sit back and say, this is how things should be done. And I think that is worth noting, especially maybe for those of us who are interested in politics, who want particular things done. We often, I think, imagine that there are easy and straightforward ways of achieving our goals, when in reality those may or may not exist as such.